Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Pr0totype. It's the closest thing Cosmonarchy Brood War has to a regular podcast, but for the most part, it's just here for me to talk about design, methodology, and musings. So we are going to go over a number of things that have happened in recent history and also what's going to come in the future, including the next CMBW tutorial. If somehow you don't know what Cosmonarchy Brood War is, it's essentially the most ambitious project ever made within StarCraft, and of course, it's here to stay. The latest developments include some work on the Zerg tutorial, as well as Ascension number 4's planning phase and general outreach, and also some Mapcrap musings. Yep, we'll get to those in short order. Up first, we'll talk about the Zerg a bit. So, Zerg are a very favorite race of mine, I would say. Not necessarily that my most favorite race in terms of like lore or aesthetic or theme, but definitely something where I feel like there's something really cool about the Zerg. There's something just decidedly right about some of their thematics when you can really put a fine point on them, and as far as like a larger organism and the way that all of their different biological cells work together and stuff. It really can feel like you're fighting a very notable and distinct enemy when they're positioned correctly and when they're played well by the opposing AI or human player. And generally speaking, when you're seeing them in action at a high level in general, it always feels pretty good. And this extends into Cosmonarchy Brood War. In fact, I'm pretty fond of saying within CMBW that I feel like what we've done with all of the races is make whatever they are only more so, So it's like Terran became more Terran with Liftoff being proliferated across the race. That's a common example that I rally behind. And it feels like Zerg became more Zerg, where obviously they still expand but easier than the other races, but they have all of this larva stuff still. But they became more Zerg because they have more ways to engage with larva. They have more ways to engage with mutating structures and units into more advanced forms. And now they have that regression system in, so when you lose the mutation, if you actually made it directly from a preceding version, say like the Kagrant Cesiant mutated into a Circuit Cesiant for anti-surface defense, well, it goes back into the Kagrant Cesiant, it's pretty cool. So it does feel to me like we have accessed and unlocked a bunch of really cool and different things about the way that the game unfolds. I don't know, it's just really cool to me. It's really neat to me that we have that as an element of the lore or thematic of the race. It's very obvious within how you play it. And it was intended to be that way, as opposed to it being maybe accidental, like you could say magic boxing and mutastacking and, mixing them up with an Ovaleth and stuff to make them auto-stack or whatever. That is still the same in CMBW, but that was clearly not intended behind Blizzard. And maybe we would change it. I mean, spoiler, we definitely would change it if it were possible. But, it's not something that's super feasible within StarCraft 1. So, yeah, it's definitely going to be one of those things that just goes by the wayside. It doesn't seem like we can make air unit pathfinding, basically, where they would have collision with each other. But maybe you could do something cool, like you would have capital craft like the Minotaur or the Solarian or something, and they would exist on a different plane than the fighter crafts like the Wraiths and the Mutas and stuff. The ones that are classed as a lighter group of units or whatever. You could have a couple of different things like that. We have that in Antikythera, our work-in-progress engine for the RTS genre. And that's something that we're going to continue to talk about a little bit later on in this year and into the next as we get it further and further operational. But going back to the Zerg, it does feel like we've been able to successfully tap into a lot of their really neat thematics and maximize how it feels, how distinct they feel versus the other races and what they can do within Cosmonarchy Brood War. We've been able to take them into a different aspect. We've been able to push them in a different direction. I really like that. Well, I guess it's like the same direction, but further down it. We've been able to push them to a different degree than the base game did. And we've been able to do that through intentional decisions. And yeah, maybe you can't say that you can claim total ownership over exactly every single aspect of how that decision worked out, but like our design edicts were set with the intention of making them feel more swarmy and more organic and like more like a living, breathing entity that is the sum of its parts, as opposed to like a separate individualized military, which is more akin to the Terrans and especially the Protoss. So it feels to me like in that case, yeah, the Zerg feel really much like that. And you think about units like the Sovraleth, where they're very iconic in that way. It's like, oh man, dude, the Sovraleth, are you kidding me? It's got so many cool units and like cool aspects to it rather. And it literally does get like slower, but more range the more Sovereigns are nearby. It does feel like you're putting together a manifold creature that's just made up of a whole bunch of other organisms, right? And that feels very Zergy as well. So I feel like we've been able to do a lot there, and it feels pretty cool. That being said, though, the tutorial, it needs to somehow encapsulate a lot of this and also present Zerg that, Zerg speech, basically, in a way that is immediately tangible to the players. And I've got some plans for that I don't remember if I've really nailed down. I've talked about it in Coffee Questions. We have a segment where supporters of the channel and of myself and of Cosmonarchy Brood War can send us some money, and then in return, we can answer questions for them at the end of the show. But we've talked a little bit about that in those kinds of segments, and for the most part, we didn't really go into super heavy details. One of the things that I've decided on is definitely that, we're going to have that chorus of voices, and that I think we're basically going to have a predominant voice with a couple of supporting voices. And I think the dominant voice is going to be the really most notorious thing about a particular AI, or a particular character, I should say. And then I guess this would include the protagonist, so I definitely shouldn't say AI. But, you're thinking about campaigns and tutorials and stuff, your protagonist character is going to be some kind of organ, right? And the organs are part of a command structure that leads all the way up to a tendril. And the tendril itself is probably not going to be presented as an individual character or even having a voice. What I was thinking is the organs, almost kind of like a biological version of the Word of God, where, I guess if you believe the Bible and stuff or whatever, basically what happens is the Word of God is passed into these people, and they are visited, and they are told things, and they know things. Like, without the visitation part, basically them just knowing things, I think, is like a cool way to encapsulate that. So the tendril would basically have a will, and that will would be exercised or made known to all of the organs. And then they would be up to them how to collaborate and work together as a body, literally, in some ways, but, certainly thematically, to come together and achieve that will. And that's sort of like, an interesting abstract way. So you wouldn't actually ever see the tendril. There wouldn't be a description of it. They're not a character. It's instead that each organ has its own set of voices and such. And the organ, basically Zerg would speak through a chorus. And the chorus is meant to represent the groups of individual cells that make up that organ. And in this case, cells are like the units and structures. So you think about it like each, Zethar core would be considered a cell, but it would be like, or maybe like a protein or something. Like, you think about like the actual biological makeup of cells and going down into like the molecular level. So, that's the sort of thing. I guess the catch-all term I usually use is agents, but you can probably find an even more organic sounding term for that. And my thinking is we could definitely talk about how the Zerg are presented and present the Zerg in such a way that it feels like they are still otherworldly and unknowable, but it doesn't, mean that you can't have dialogue in Zerg campaigns or whatever. Because this is a concern in our, my brainchild, not only Cosmonarchy Brood War, but obviously I have another brainchild, which is the Xibalba universe. And yes, it's deliberately pronounced that way. Xibalba is a setting where you've got all these different regencies, which are our stand-in term for races. More on that later in the coffee section, actually. And one of the main ideas behind one of the different races is that they're like this autonomous robot collective called the Resellium. And this autonomous collective is kind of mindless in a way, where they're on a runaway task. It's like the paperclip machine turned into a playable race, right? So the famous example in sci-fi or whatever is the paperclip machine. It's told to make paperclips out of whatever raw material. So whatever you need to do to harvest and make paperclips, make paperclips. And the idea is that eventually it consumes the entire planet and then goes out into space, all with the goal of making paperclips. So that's kind of like what the Resellium are doing. Instead of paperclips, it's like, just harvesting resources and assembling more material, maybe for like a war effort specifically. It's kind of ambiguous as to what their precise goal would be, but the result is that they just speed through the whole universe, doing their best to, disassemble and salvage all of the different aspects. And maybe not mindless in a sense that they don't like take away valuable assets for their combat, because it's not like they're going to start disassembling the planet that they're fighting on, because eventually that will just result in their whole force being destroyed when the planet becomes destabilized, or maybe that just distracts them from doing things that are actually related to combat ops. So you can't really say mindless in that sense, but it's just, you would imagine maybe they wouldn't have too much dialogue, right? It's hard to present dialogue in that way. Now, obviously, I think it's certainly possible to do, and I've got some ideas for how to do it. But the Zerg were kind of positioned in a similar way to the Resellium in that, how do you have dialogue that actually tells the player what's going on? It's like, how do you have a campaign where you play as Zerg, just like how do you have a campaign where you play as Resellium? Because you need dialogue, you need transmissions. I mean, maybe you don't need it, but it would be very avant-garde to go without those things. And I don't want to go without those things. I think they can add a lot of character. I look at it as an interesting challenge, a vector for really cool things to happen, if we can actually make it happen. So that's the goal, anyway. So, you know a little bit about how I plan to present the Zerg with their chorus of voices, the organs simply knowing the will of the tendril that they belong to, and maybe some communication between organs of hostile tendrils or distinct tendrils. I mean, they tend to always be hostile to each other, just out of a matter of course. Is sort of like an autoimmune reaction to a foreign pathogen. And obviously, they're not going to be friendly with Protoss and Terran, generally speaking. There will be some very rare cases where that's not true. But the vast majority of interactions between a tendril and an outside force, regardless of what race the outside force is war. And tendrils are massive. Like, everything that the Overmind used in the original campaign would be the smallest ever tendril. It probably wouldn't even qualify as a tendril in terms of scale and size, like number of agents and stuff. So to give you an idea of what we're working on here, we are talking about stuff that like rivals the scale, probably supersedes the scale, but I'm not super familiar with this, so a Warhammer 40,000 expert can correct me or whatever. But the Tyranid hives that, or hive fleets or whatever they're called, where they have like these, I think it's supposed to be like billions or trillions of agents and stuff. Like that's kind of the scale we're talking about when it comes to the tendrils. And we can't represent that number of units in game, so it's more like the organs are meant to make up a part of that. And they're supposed to be like countless organs making up each tendril. So the tendrils are not really presented in such a way that you could theoretically destroy them. Instead, we care a bit more about, what happens to the Zerg, what do they do? Maybe we reveal a bit more about their higher goal if they have one. Maybe each tendril has a different higher goal even. And so there might be like more to them that meets the eye, but we still present it very seriously, solemnly, in a sense that it's not, I guess soberly would be another word for it. It's not like, you don't have characters like the Daggeth and Zaz characters where they are making weirdly emotional decisions and irrational ones, admittedly in a really stupid situation. I mean, the Overmind makes the ultimate irrational decision several times over where he like goes to ire and then in the first place with like all of the stuff, but also everything he does related to Kerrigan is really dumb. I'm saying he, even though it's probably an it technically, but maybe not. I feel like maybe they used pronouns they might have used like he in a few different cases when referring to the Overmind, like his whaler stuff. I don't know. The Blizzard writers had a really lazy idea. I think it was just Metzen for the most part, but for the Overmind, they had a really lazy idea of like what's epic, where they tried to make the Overmind biblical and stuff. And to me, like referencing human mythology or religion and all that stuff is kind of dumb for aliens because aliens they're not humans. So like, why would you make it so that that's a thing? So that's a weird thing that I always never really agreed with. The fact that the Protoss have like Roman names and stuff. Technically CMBW still has Templar as like a branch, but I can probably come up with like a replacement name for that at some point. And it doesn't use Templar for like the name of the High Templar. That's just now the Cantavis. So that's like a completely different unit, name or whatever. So yeah, anyway, the Zerg, presenting them that way with their voices and like making it so that their dialogue and diction and stuff, the way that their dialogue is written. We talked a little bit about how it'll be voice acted essentially, but the way that it's written is going to be kind of interesting. I haven't exactly cracked that code yet, but I will be working on that later on this week and the next, especially once we're past the initial phase of Ascension number 4. And I'm really looking forward to getting some more progress made on the Zerg tutorial. I think it's already going to be pretty interesting. The premise of it is that you are a Genesis organ, which is basically the name of like a classification of organ that hasn't yet specialized, right? It's still gestating. It's still brand new, essentially. And your test to see, survival of the fittest all the way down, you're going to see if you can excise a rotting organ that has some sort of derelict organ. And the idea behind that is, of course, to, what can you realistically speaking do when you're going up against a more veteran organ? Well, maybe the more veteran organ here is actually, like I said, rotting and it's decaying or something. So it doesn't actually have the same level of power that it would normally have. And so the mission name is called Autophagy. And Obviously, in that case, it's a reference to, the way that cells recycle certain aspects of them in order to stay clean and remove the junk, so to speak. And you're going up against what I've codenamed a withered organ, which is this, I was calling it rotting earlier. It's kind of the same idea. But the withered organ is basically past its prime, and either it will consume you to rejuvenate, which is hence the autophagy part, or you will consume it because you're removing the junk. And like basically whoever survives here is going to be rejuvenated in that sense. And obviously for the case of like if there's going to be multiple missions in the Zerg tutorial or whatever, chronologically, logically you would be the one to say that you won if you're going to play the second and third maps and stuff or whatever. I'm not sure exactly how many maps we'll have, but I just want to get one out for each race for now, just so that new players have some idea of what's expected of them. And, we talked about the Terran tutorial some couple episodes of this podcast ago. Obviously, that guy, the officer you face off in that training simulation, builds like hundreds of thousands of, no, not really that many, but a really large number of bio. Military units just charging you down with the very first moves that he makes, and his idea is that he wants to end this game really soon so that he can go home and relax, and he doesn't really respect you. And so he's going to make sure that you know that. He's just going to be hyper aggressive. And for bad players or new players, this is going to be an interesting crucible for them where obviously they have defender's advantage. They've got nice choke points. They've got high ground, and cliff advantage in CMBW is super good because it gives you, no longer does RNG stuff, but it gives you +2 range when you're fighting a target. So if your enemy is on the low ground, you get +2 range attacking them. If it's the same height, there is no advantage. And so that's like one example of, oh shit, like the game actually does reward me for taking this area. And obviously the map itself was constructed with that in mind. So you can use that to your advantage. There's some neutral anchors, our name for the bunker, placed up on those and made it so that you can easily garrison them without even needing to set them up yourself. And that works out pretty well because from a map balancing standpoint, it means that you don't really need the initial resources or even the know-how of what cliff advantage is. You can kind of learn intuitively. And we don't need to like handhold you with like really weird dialogue events that the dialogue for that mission is all written, actually, at least the first draft of it. We might be adding more events later on or slightly retooling them later. And that's like one case where it's like, yeah, the Terran tutorial, it's going to put you through your paces, and even if you're a good player, even if you're a veteran of CMBW, you won't be able to win just by rushing him down because he's going for this military focused opener. So you kind of have to like actually play the game and, go through the motions and stuff and prove that you're good in order to claim victory, which is all I ever really want out of the single player content. Obviously the AI is going to be somewhat volatile and maybe cheesable. I don't make any promises that you can't find some magic solution to the problem in the early stages of the game by doing some wacky rush or whatever that wouldn't ever work in a normal game, or maybe even wouldn't work on a melee map, but might work on like one of these specific campaign maps or whatever. Either way, though, I'm mostly just looking forward to having the AI, kill a bunch of noobs in these tutorials and eventually teach the people who are learning how the game works and are willing to learn how the game works, teaching them about the game by virtue of, giving them a lot of opportunity to have that sandbox associated with them. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. And as we get into that Zerg tutorial, I would like to do the same thing for that race, basically have a very almost like, mindless type of AI that doesn't necessarily play to the maximum level of power, but does want to train a bunch of units in the early stages and see if he can run you over, or it can run you over indeed, because of course this is a Zerg. So can that withered organ, just steamroll you in the early stages of the game? Maybe if you're not prepared. But that will give you opportunity to, explore. Like the Zerg tutorial is kind of expected to be a little bit harder than the Terran tutorial in terms of the map. It's not favoring you as much with the terrain in the same way, and the map isn't symmetrical. The Terran one is. It's not symmetrical in the sense that you start in the same spots, but it's like left to right symmetrical. So if you know the left side of the map, you can guess what the right side of the map looks like. But the other tutorial, the Zerg one, is like completely asymmetric, and the same is going to be true for the Protoss. Actually, the Protoss is going to be the intermediate tutorial, if you will, while the Zerg is going to be the hardest, or at least that's my initial plan. But I'm making the Zerg one before the Protoss one because the Protoss were still under construction with some of their tech recently, and I didn't want to make a jump on that right this moment. So yeah, anyway, there's some information about the Zerg tutorial and how it's shaping up. I'm obviously taking the opportunity to figure out how I'm going to present the Zerg from a narrative and lore related standpoint. But also, really critically, I think it's going to be doing its job as an opportunity for learning things, teaching players things. I think it's going to do its job as a tutorial, and it will do so without really breaking the immersion of the player too, I think, which is going to be really nice and being able to say that, Let's move on to talking about the most exciting thing that is happening this weekend, I'm sure. Nobody's getting married, right? There's nothing else. Nothing else is happening. It's just Ascension number 4. The signups are complete. And you know what? We brought Connor out of retirement. Connor 5620, also known as Home of StarCraft, which to me, I always wanted to call him Homie of StarCraft. At least he's my homie. I've known him for years. It's really nice to have him back. He's going to be playing as Terran, and his group, the Hydrith Theory group, is actually going to have a Protoss in Biddy B, a Terran in Connor, and then a Zerg in Nablime. And Nablime and Connor are actually from the same neck of the woods. They're from Australia. Isn't that crazy? The boys from down under and a homie that's up in Maine. Yeah, those are the 3 men that are over here, punching their ticket into the playoffs, perhaps? Well, that's certainly what they're vying for. But that's really exciting to me, because we also obviously have the Shambler in the second group alongside a newcomer named Keen and Enos, who's been around for a while, but has been mostly contributing through music lately and otherwise just been like kind of a casual viewer, is only now interested in jumping into the tutorial space or the tournament space and participating. So that's going to be cool to see him in action. And all of them are Zerg. That's group 2, Swarm selected, or group B, as I should say. And it's interesting to me because obviously the Shambler, I don't know anything about Keen. They might be really good too, because apparently they can take games off of Nablime and Brood War. I don't know about CMVW. They're going to need to learn. So they probably won't be like in tip-top shape for this. But maybe they can defeat Enos. I don't know how good Enos is because I've never seen him play. He keeps underselling his level of play, or keeps saying like, yeah, manage expectations. I'm probably going to be pretty bad, but I can't wait to play anyway, which is the good mindset. If you're going to be bad or whatever, it doesn't really matter. What matters is if you have fun, if you enjoy it, and if it makes you feel like you should improve, makes you want to improve, and makes you actually strive to improve. That's what we want out of our competitive side of the community, and that's actually what we want out of the content too. That's why the tutorials are going to fail bad players, is because, well, it's a call to improve. It's a call to get better at the game. So I'm really excited to see that group. It's all Zerg. It's going to be really interesting because who knows what kind of crazy ZVZ stuff is going to happen in CMBW. It's such a different game than Brood War. Hopefully some better matches is what I'm hoping for, but we'll see. And but obviously I was talking about the other contenders. That's Mystery Meat over in Group A alongside Benno and 3Crow. That's a Terran, and a Protoss in that order. 3Crow playing as Protoss instead of Zerg. Obviously, he took the world by storm when 3Crow did the double Kager drop in playoffs against Mystery Meat. God damn, that was a good move. I can't believe that man had the balls to do that, but I was so happy. It's too bad it didn't work out, spoilers, but it was good. It was good. I really liked it. I appreciated the move. But yeah, so Mystery Meat and the Shambler, they have won the last set of tournaments. It was the Shambler won the first paid one. Mystery Meat won the first original one, like Ascension number 1. But Shambler won the second one, and then Ascension 3, Mystery Meat was able to take that one. I'm spoiling all of the events here. Just skip if you didn't want to. Oh, wait, I said it after the spoilers. Fuck. But all good tournaments anyway, entertaining stuff to watch if you want. Very different game state now, so really not useful for like studying up. Maybe you can study the playstyles of your opponents, but I don't know about anything else. And then on top of that all, you've got all this sorts of cool shit that happened in these games and stuff, and it just makes me think like, okay, yeah, we got Mystery Meat and the Shambler. And I think Fagudo is in the chat saying like, is it always going to be Mystery Meat and the Shambler? Well, I will remind you guys that in Ascension number 3, Mesk almost defeated the Shambler in a 5-game series. That could have been epic in the semifinals if Mesk went up against Mystery Meat. I mean, I don't know if we would have had a 5-game grand finals then, but it would have been interesting to see what would have happened. I don't know. We'll never know. Maybe Mesk will play again later, but for now, we're not seeing that in action. Now, that being said, I'm really excited to see that we have more, pretty reasonably high skill players coming in. Nablime has really started to be, playing himself in a form. He seems like he should be able to top his group. We'll see about whether Connor is able to do it too. I don't know anything about this Keen person either. Like I said, they can apparently take games off in Nablime and Brood War. Who knows what's going to happen, man? We might have like 5 out of 9 or 4 out of 9 players, half or slightly more than half, slightly less than half, depending, be able to contend for the tournament. And that's how much parity you can have when you're just starting off with a competitive space, a budding competitive scene. And I'm really excited to see Ascension number 4 in action. So that's this Saturday, the 16th of September. Hope to see you there. Of course, we already have the scheduled VODs and the streams and stuff, so check them out when you can. And really cool stuff, honestly. I'm really looking forward to that. Hopefully everything works out just fine. We've also had some recent attention from the broader Brood War community. I feel like this is a good time as any to thank Gypsy once again in a formal piece of content for his raid. He hit me up with a bunch of viewers from his stream at the end, and at the end of all of that, or the end result of all that, is that we have a couple of new faces in the community, new faces in the Discord server, more people installing stuff. But then, I don't know if this is related or if it's just fortuitous, but I was on a couple of StarCraft streams that night and this morning. I'm recording this, by the way, on the 13th of September, and I hung out with Urbmon, I hung out with Balance, and they both knew me. They both recognized me. Urbmon, I understand a bit more because I talked with him for a while. I've known him for a long time now, actually. Or at least, I've been in his stream and stuff. And it was cool to see him, he actually watched that 3 Crow moment and, on stream and stuff while he was waiting for his games and whatnot. It was neat. It was cool to see, people's reactions to all this sorts of different shit. And, we're getting there on the graphics side of things, of course. Nobody's seen the new Huracan yet, really. But, the fact that people just knew that I did modding and stuff, it's this very small, tight-knit community in that if you're streaming to the StarCraft section on Twitch, people probably watch without saying much, or if they say anything at all. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's kind of interesting. This guy does some interesting things or whatever. And maybe that's just more people are starting to take notice, or maybe they already knew and Gypsy just happened to decide to raid me that one day for no reason. Either way, that was pretty cool. And I feel like if we can get the attention of people we've said Hawk before because he plays NHFFAs sometimes. We've said, obviously, the big name is Artosis. If he can stream it or something, that would be based. But in general, if you could imagine just getting the attention of some of these foreigners, getting the attention of some of the Koreans, that would be pretty cool. I don't speak Korean, so I can't really interface with them per se, but it would be pretty neat to be able to get their takes. I just imagine the Kek W's, the Korean version of Kek W, whatever that is. Imagine that in fucking, when they see the anchor lift off or whatever. I did tell Urbmon, I was because he was watching one of the older matches of the Ascension tournament, and I was like, dude, wait until you see the bunker lift off. He's like, the bunker lifts off? What? And I was like, yeah, exactly. I mean, his name is Urbmon. I don't know what you guys expected from my impersonation of his voice, but listen, I'm just saying he lives up to his name. Cool guy, though. Cool guy. Anyway, the main idea was it was just cool to see that people were giving the CMBW some attention or recognizing it, and that feels really good for me because it means that we actually have a bit more pull, perhaps, to get more eyes on the project than we previously thought. So I'm really excited about continuing that. Actually, after this podcast is done in terms of its recording, I will be, of course, uploading it for our coffee members who get it a day early. But then beyond that, I will be spending some time streaming some more development. And mostly, I mean, it's not because I'm expecting to get another raid at the end of Gypsy's stream or whatever. It's mostly just because I think it makes sense to do. And also, I want to get some fucking work done anyway. Let's go, man. I was actually really energized to improve some of the web pages. I did the CMBW overhaul of the front page for the website a couple days back. And then today, I I adjusted the tournament section so that you saw the past events front and center. So you didn't have to go digging for for links to the different tournaments or whatever. And I think that's really important, right? Because it just means at a glance, you don't need to do much reading. I can link you one place and you can be like, oh, cool, there's this thing here. And obviously that means that there's a thing for you to check out. And I think that's important. So obviously I also recorded the install guide today, really that was yesterday. I did most of the work for that and I just edited it, rendered it, and got it uploaded today. So that's another thing. Back to castovers as well. Did a castover today. So, more video content is happening. Hopefully we can continue working on the tutorials and such. I want to make a primer video. I want to make an Ascension explainer video. I want to make all these videos so that people can more easily find out about the project and just make it a little bit more instantaneous as far as how people can spread the word and stuff. More convincing than a big confusing, it's not really that confusing. It's not really a tall order for them to read a fucking webpage, but most people don't have the attention span for it. And I honestly, in some ways, I don't blame them because a lot of shit is not worth their time. So if they're operating under that assumption from being Brood War elitists, for example, I understand why they wouldn't want to try something other than, what they've already known. So we got to get them on some of the big epic things, right? That's where the super weapon unit profile or roster profile will come in handy. You get to see stuff like the Diadem, the Star Sovereign, and the Sovroleth. But hey, we need more graphics for all those, so we're waiting. We're waiting a sec for that. Now, all that being said, obviously the Brood War community may or may not accept us with interest and open arms. However, I do think there's a strong chance for me to be able to reach out to people like, Nyokin or, obviously Gypsy's apparently aware of stuff. Urbmon, who made a splash at StarCon recently as like an up-and-coming Zerg player, although he's been around for a long time. So I don't know if you can say up-and-coming, but he's definitely been, leveling up his play, we can say. And it's just like, it's cool to see these people who like play at these top foreign tournaments and stuff and know that they also know about CMBW and might check it out or whatever. So that's really cool to me. That's really neat to me. And I'm very happy about that. So the other thing that I wanted to cover here is some melee map considerations. Ascension number 4 will have at least 2 new maps, maybe a third. I might replace Equilibrium with Exidu, but I'm not 100% sure on that one yet. The main thing that I was thinking about when it came to the map pool is that I didn't want Main Street to still be in the map pool if we were also going to keep Infinite Velocity. And Infinite Velocity received some changes recently that made it a little bit more stable and, kept the Nidus, but obviously made it so that the way to access it took a little bit more effort and took a little bit longer if you were just going to passively allow it to be accessed. And that way you can definitely make some air units to snipe it if you're not interested in using it at all. And I feel like that's interesting and it's at least worth trying. And I feel like on the same time, you could make standard games work on that map even before that change. It doesn't really feel like you can make standard games work on Main Street. And at the same time, the Cheese Fest is a little bit all over the place where it doesn't necessarily feel super skillful because it's just really hard to anticipate things. So I just don't think, as entertaining as the map was, I just don't know that it was actually that good of a map to include. I still think it's hilarious, and I really want to see more people play on it. Maybe that can be like our version of Lost Temple or whatever, where people play on like quote unquote bad maps for the purposes of like, I don't know, getting people confused and like, there was the Artosis bad map FFA league or whatever. He did he did foreign pros and then he did actual like Korean pros, like bona fide Korean pros on all these bad maps and went through the whole list and stuff. And that's really funny to me. Like maybe we can include Main Street as like the decider, map for that. Who knows? But that's our version of Crystalis or something. However, I think the main thing that I would say outside of that is, we also swapped out. I'm trying to remember what other map that we ended up swapping out here. It was Nemesis Station, apparently. That's an interesting one. So Nemesis Station was also swapped out for Otherworld, and the Main Street map was swapped out for Nightfall. So those are going to be the 2 new maps. Nightfall is by Veek, and Otherworld is by me. And I feel like those maps are going to give pretty good games, pretty solid ones. They're fairly solid macro maps if you can get to that stage, especially Otherworld. Otherworld is almost kind of like a meditation on Megalith Empire. If people remember that map, it was a platform map that had some asteroid stuff in the left-hand side. It had vertical bases, right? It was like the that flavor of symmetry. I believe it's YY, because it's symmetry across the top axis. And players started on the right-hand side and could, sort of flavor out to the left-hand side, right? Expand out. But the rush distance was really small, and it resulted in some very fast games. So this map is much bigger. You're in the corners or closer to the corners. You have a little bit more maneuvering room and such. And it feels like you can get a lot more done in that particular kind of context. So you can have more macro-oriented games. A neutral anchor in the middle of the map, not really anything super special. There's like a high ground path you can take and a low ground path you can take between the players in a more straightforward way, and then there's obviously the back entrance. So kind of interesting in that way. And besides that, I'm mostly just interested in trying to make some maps a little bit more on the safer side, but also seeing and evaluating, whether or not we're actually going to see a large number of rush games. And if we are going to see those kinds of rush games, are they skillful? Are they, interesting and good? Or is it like, some issue with balance or an issue with the map? So Equilibrium seems to have been serviceable, but I am interested in replacing it because of the maps that are in the pool. It might be the next most condensed one in terms of size. And I mean effective size, not necessarily the idea of, what would you call it? Like actual map dimensions is not really what I'm talking about here. It feels like you can't necessarily go into a heavy game in terms of bases because the base count feels kind of small. I would say like the thing I'm the least favorite about or the least satisfied about is the low ground third, if you want to call it that, that's directly above or below the player 1 and player 2 norths, or mains rather. So you see like the base right past the high ground ledge of your main is what I'm talking about there. That one feels really quite difficult to hold because you have to go all the way around your base. And then there's not really like a good third base option necessarily because everything else could be wrapped around or is also really far away. So it feels like comparing that to something like Repulsion, which is much more solid in terms of being able to have that macro flare and having so many options and such. And then you also compare that to something like the new Nightfall map. It does feel like to me that there's more options for something like Nightfall. And, you know, you have like a similar idea almost with a low ground option for the third, or also, you know, like a middle base that you can take for tempo and map control, and a high ground base that you can take that's a little bit further away that helps like solidify flanks and stuff. It's like a similar idea, but executed much better. And it's funny because they're both by the same player or a same mapper, right? They're both by Veek. So that feels really cool to me that Veek has been able to improve the map making in that sense, because I feel like that's a much stronger case for himself. But I did mention Exidu, which is a new map by the Beaver. I think if I replaced Equilibrium with Exidu, funnily enough, the Beaver would have the most maps in the competitive map pool. I'm pretty sure because he also has Boscovine still in the pool. Although I was thinking also about potentially replacing that at some point. But that's also like a classic macro map. It's also, you know, it's cool to have a swamp map. This is not really related to gameplay and like integrity of the tournament. But just visually, it's really cool to have swamp maps and stuff. So maybe we need more like that, you know? Anyway, there's some cool stuff at play in Exidu. Mostly I really like and appreciate the level of play around with tiles. Again, an aesthetic point and not really a point that is related to like tournament integrity. But I do feel like it functions pretty well as a legit map. There's an in-base sort of natural that's lower yield with only 5 minerals and a single geyser, 5 mineral fields and a single geyser. But then there's a based directly south of the player's mains, and that one is much more conventional with 8 mineral fields, a geyser, and a ridge. And then you go into some chokes that are fairly easy to hold, including a spot that you can use to easily hold off ground-based assaults through the bottom play, and then like that kind of forces your opponent to go through the upper middle. I don't know, it's just really, it's an interesting idea. It's like a bunch of interesting ideas in the maps. So I'm looking forward to seeing those in action. I'm not 100% sure how flexible some of the pathways are, and obviously since the map is mostly placed with custom tiles, it feels like it would be really hard for the Beaver to make adjustments, but not impossible. It's just tedious, right? So we'll have to wait and see what players think of the map, and maybe we won't replace it after all, or jump it in after all, until we get some more games on it. But some games were made on it, so I'll probably do some castovers of those soon. And there's also a couple of other maps worth shouting out in the needs testing folder that seem like they could be pretty solid. I haven't actually seen Ashy Alternation yet because the casts or the games on it haven't been confirmed to me. Like I haven't done castovers for them, but it seems like that's apparently a pretty solid map. Like Ben seems happy with it. That's by Ben Taberski. He also made False Promises, which the Shambler said was his favorite Ben Taberski map. So that might be promising too. And I have played a little bit on it. So it's kind of interesting to see, you know, some stuff like that. Maybe there will be some interesting games that are played on that I can cast over. And then I don't know anything about the Shambler's latest maps, but he has maps called Godcairn and Hellstone that obviously have pretty interesting names at the very least. And I did do a cast over of Hellstone recently, so I kind of know that map, but it has been updated since then with thicker you know, walls or whatever for the burning wall trick that he did. And I think maybe some other changes, probably some bug fixes and stuff. It's a bit of a barren map right now in terms of decor, but who knows what might happen on that. It does seem like there's some opportunity for that to be tested around and such. So yeah, we're seeing more mappers, we're seeing more map makers, or maps in general being made. And who knows which ones of these will be added. You know, it's been a while since we've actually made an edition. I swapped out Crossguard for Death Spiral, and Wellington got replaced with Nemesis Station, was it? And that was like, those are the only ones. So like, so far we've actually, you know, just replaced like, it looks like one map at a time. Although I guess that's not actually true, is it? Because we had Terminus get replaced by Wellington between Ascensions 1 and 2. And then Ascension 2 lost Crossguard for Death Spiral and Wellington for Nemesis Station. And so that was 2 maps. So now we were talking about going to potentially 3 maps. So maybe we'll just replace fucking 4 maps for Ascension 5. Who knows, man? We're crazy around here. But I thought it was prudent to talk about maps because obviously they are a pinnacle of Brood War. They're a pinnacle of how Brood War was balanced. And in CMBW, obviously they hold balanced considerations, but it feels like it's really interesting to see those maps in action and also to show that, hey, if you bothered, modding the tile set, or if Blizzard bothered making the game reasonable as far as its tiles go, then you could have really beautiful maps like what we have for our melee maps. You could have functional ramps that don't have total insane bugs with terrain and stuff, and so on and so forth. That I think is really important and good and lovely, and I'm a huge fan of getting that implemented in that sense. I feel like it's really cool anyway to see these kinds of cool maps that have all of these different tiles and stuff. And if we can make the melee maps beautiful in addition to functional, that will be a great thing. And if you're wondering where the map screenshot comes from here, the screenshot for this particular episode, it comes from False Idols, which is a Desert 3-player map that you can play as. It's a scenario map. You can play it single player, although the AI is a bit dumb, of course. You can play it in cooperative, obviously, and it's a pretty entertaining map. It definitely is a bit chaotic and eclectic and requires you to manage multiple players and teams. It's pretty cool, and I feel like it's a cool thing. It was a birthday map for Pr0totype, and that's why there's a 3 in the middle of the map, made of 3s. That's a lot of fucking 3s, dude. In fact, Pr0totype gets a 3 made of 3s. That's 3 3s. Holy shit, he can't stop winning. And I guess I'll close this particular section out by talking about Mapcrap and how it needs to come back. There's not really much else to say, though. It really does just need to come back. So I would like to say that Mapcrap will at some point return, but I can't really say anything else yet because, this contest, this idea of, we want this, like, I don't even know if you could call it a contest. It's just like an event where like a bunch of people will band together, make some maps. Are they going to be melee maps? Are they going to be scenario maps, wacky campaign mission type things? Who knows? But they just have to be RTS related and probably CMBW exclusive because I don't feel like playing original StarCraft anymore. So yeah, Mapcrap does need to come back, doesn't it? We have arrived at the coffee questions section of this episode of Pr0totype. Ben Taberski is going to open us up here, and he says, what is your opinion on games, and more specifically RTS games, straying away from the word race and opting for things like factions? Well, factions are, of course, a useful term unto themselves, but they kind of mean something different than race. I know that Warlord's Battlecry refers to their races as sides, and I mean, I guess technically there are like many sides to a conflict or whatever, but that also feels really silly. And that's a game from way back. Probably because technically like barbarians were humans, but not, and like knights were humans. There wasn't like one human race. You know what I mean? So I guess I understand why they went for a thing like that, but they decided sides. Like sides is such a weird term for it. Factions wouldn't necessarily have made sense, but because maybe they didn't want nations because there can be multiple nations of barbarians or whatever. So like, what would you call them? Now in Xibalba, we use regencies, but that's designed by design because race refers to like an actual idea of like, oh, everybody's human here, or everybody's Protoss here, or everybody's Zerg here. Haha, Zerg here. But there's this idea behind, games modern wise. I should add that Ben Taberski adds in his question, personally, he thinks it's really fucking stupid, and he uses the advanced clown emoji. Well, I agree with you, brother. But I agree in the sense that it doesn't really make sense to replace it for faction, just because XD, I'm social justice or whatever. Like, I don't think it makes sense to replace it because the word race is problematic, which is something that I think the Immortal developers said. I'm sure it was about Immortal. I just don't remember which guy said it, and I'm sure it was also something that he said. It was a developer, so I shouldn't say that I think that, because that's kind of like, that's a goofy thing to say that somebody said if they didn't really say it, and I want you guys to know that I 100% remember it was an Immortal developer. But it's just a meme. Like, I don't really care about things that are problematic. I don't think that is going to help you make a good game, generally, and that's what I care about. Now, the reason we don't use race in Xibalba is because that's not really the idea behind the regencies. The regencies are made up of, in some cases, multiple races. And so if you just referred to it as races, it would be inaccurate, which is like the only reason you should really care about changing the nomenclature. The fact that it's, faction now, I guess that's technically true, but also faction kind of implies like you can have factions within a race or factions within a regency, where that would be like nations or groups or whatever. And those would be like, that would be who you play as in melee matchups or whatever, mirror matchups rather. It's like, oh, if I'm fighting other Ansifi as an Ansifi, and for context, that's a race within Xibalba, yeah, I would say that I'm like a specific nation of Ansifi and they're a different one. Or we're of, they're like a military group or something like that. That's where their faction makes sense as like a term. But we're still both Ansifi, and that's our regency. And if we didn't have regencies like the Makral Das that were multiple races, or like obviously the other ones to think about are the Ember Seat, which is this like coalition of lesser races, and then there's also, of course, the Omindir, or I guess it's Omindris rather. That's a case where it's like the Omindir and the Diridris are together. That's multiple races. I mean, if you can even call the Omindir a race, because they're these like giant serpentine onyx type characters, very bizarre metal creatures, and you wouldn't necessarily think of that as like a biological race in the same way. So maybe that's a case where like the Rosellium aren't a race because they are not, biological, and biological things are like have a race or whatever. I don't know. That makes a little bit more sense to me anyway. But I don't know. I mean, I just look at it like, why do you even have to worry about something like that? It really comes down to the reason why they're changing the term. If they're changing the term because they think race is a problematic word, they're fucking goobers. And we can figure that out because they're not going to make impressive things if that's what they're worried about. If they're, doing it because it actually makes sense to do it, because of, accuracy, and because they need to preserve the word race to use in appropriate contexts, which is basically what's up with Xibalba, that also makes sense. I can't remember if I referred to the Onatar entities as races or not. I guess I can quickly take a look at the page. But that's a case where maybe that's a little bit more like, oh, what's up with that? Do we have... Yeah, I actually do have races here. I don't even know if races is correct for Onatar, but, you might as well give it a go. Technically, Onatar and Pangea both have, reflections of humanity as the different races. And in that sense, is it really a different race? Well, maybe it's like the idea is that they're so very distinct now that they might as well be a different race. And so it's useful to refer to them as such. So really, I only care about the terminology in the context of that, where it makes sense to care about the terminology. I don't really care about, oh, it's offensive because you're implying that they're black or whatever. Like, that was a thing that actually happened with orcs. And all I could think of was, you think that orcs are referencing black people? Maybe you're the racist. So anyway, don't be racist, Ben, and thanks for your question and all your support, dude. The Shambler asks, if you had to make a story set in the real world, what would it be about and why? This is a tough one, because if I had to make a story set in the real world, I mean, I'm assuming in this case we can do fiction and buzz up the story, but the idea is that the setting is just the real world. So it's not like it has to be, about character, like it has to be historically accurate about, things that happened in contemporary society or whatever. I could do an alien invasion in the real world, I assume, is like that's within scope of the question. I would say, I don't know, what would it be? I think if I was limited to that, I would probably want to... I think I would want to try to imagine like a fantasy type of story where there's a bunch of different like entities in, you imagine like cryptids and stuff, things that people have had historical sightings of, but now it's all like, oh, we can't find them. They must not exist. And like having one of them actually exist, but having it like lead you as a gateway into a broader world. So that almost kind of feels like a cop-out, because I'm basically being like, oh yeah, we're set in the real world, but here's how we get to a fantasy world or a sci-fi world or some other wild shit that I can do wild things in. But I think I would want that, some kind of like gateway into that. But at the same time, if I am somehow going to be limited away from even that, I'd probably want to do a story about... I did think to myself, I could answer this question about like doing a story about how a small cabal of elites, control the vast majority of entertainment and dumb the populace into, tired compliance. And, they're slowly cultivating their reach and control of the entire world and blah, 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 blah. And then like the punchline would be, yeah, that's actually what we already have, but enough about real life or whatever. I don't even know if that's actually true though. So, you didn't hear it from me, FBI. Please don't assassinate me. And I want to say besides that, I don't know. I guess like if I'm not in allowing any sort of fiction, like any sort of like fantasy, I guess, but it's like, contemporary fiction. Like it can be about like a fictitious, war hero or whatever. What kind of story would I tell? Because like if the story is set in the real world, it doesn't have to be like a campaign in an RTS or whatever. It was just like a lot of the questions that I get asked about, like what would I make, or what about this? What do you think about this premise or whatever? It's like related to that. So if it's just like anything, it doesn't even have to be a game. I guess I could probably tell a story about the interesting sort of worship, like the cult of worship that is going on with like Moloch, the owl god and stuff, and Bohemian Grove. I'd probably want to investigate that and then like tell a story about that, like what's real about that, if that's even possible to be investigated, just because I find it fascinating what really influential and powerful people do. That most people would think of as really unhinged and silly, or like absolutely slapstick, or maybe horrifying. I think like having more stories about things like that you can take seriously and that feel plausible, especially if they actually are well researched and real in that sense, it helps to take the mask off of the idea that like, oh, the average influential person is like so beyond us. Like, no, they do probably even more silly things. They're not impressive people in the sense of like they've got good moral fiber and stuff. They're people who must be mocked out of their office at any cost. So that might be something that I try to fuck around with. There's some revolutionary edicts within that answer for you. And hopefully that answered your question. I mean, why? Well, I kind of answered why, but yeah, just fuck them. I was going to say like, fuck them kids, obviously, fuck them adults, fuck them people who are on Epstein's island, bro. There's another one I would do. The many ways Epstein did not kill himself. That's probably one of the things I would try to, explore. Yeah, that could be kind of neat. I don't know. Maybe I'd make a story about love, man. Maybe I'd make a story about falling in love and flying across the world or whatever. But that's one of the ideas that I have anyway, is, if you have to make a story set in the real world and it can't be too far out there, just pick something that actually is real and stranger than fiction and make your story about that. So yeah, Moloch the owl god. There you go. Ahmed the chicken god. Coming soon to a movie theater near you. Thanks, Shambler, for your question and all the support. I wanted to shout out Ben and Shambler anyway, because they've been making maps lately. And even if those maps don't end up making it into the competitive pool or, whatever, even if they don't end up making great games, it's still really cool to see maps being made. That's one of the lifebloods of a competitive space within an RTS, is getting more military or military levels. I was thinking of like competitive levels, multiplayer levels. So getting more of those, pretty good. So thanks. Myrian, he actually asked 2 questions, and I think he had an or in between these, but I'm going to answer them both because that's how much I like that guy. Also because we kind of actually had a smaller number of questions this time around, so I don't mind taking a bit of time to answer multiple. So the first question Myrian asks is, will there be any connection or reference to your previous works in Cosmonarchy proper, aside from unit and faction archetypes? So obviously I did mention in the previous episode, or maybe it was, I think this was the previous episode, but because it was fortuitous that I was talking about Ahmed and then I answered a question about Ahmed. But Ahmed is in everything that I work on for sure. I mean, really, Ahmed's in everything in general. He's omnipresent. So you have to say Ahmed's pretty cool, pretty based, and pretty epic. And Ahmed also is, he's just neat, he's just cool. He's a cool guy. And I think when you look at Ahmed and you think about him, you're going to see him in all of our games, all of our works. But beyond Ahmed, will there be references? Probably. I did imagine that you could add the Ascozi into CMBW as a 4th race, and might be possible to make them balanced as like, if you think about them as an idea of like, this is them when they're a budding race. But also, I think the time is so vast that it feels like it would be pretty hard to believe that the Ascozi were still alive all those years in the future and hadn't become a really massively powerful civilization. So maybe in like a Dune context where like the species really heavily fragments and changes to accommodate the new realities of the universe. Maybe you can imagine the Ascozzi survive into the Xibalba setting, but either way, like that might be like a retroactive thing where it's like, I came up with this race and then I injected it into CMBW when we extended iScript or something, and now we have a fourth race. Isn't that epic? And that is pretty epic if that's the case. But that would be like one case. Like maybe then we could have, I guess that it would be more likely that something like the Bithrantir might have some references to, CMBW or something like that, where they like make reference to certain characters or events or like allusions that really only super attentive people are going to pick up on, and otherwise will just sound like they're referencing some event that happened a long time ago, because it did. And maybe that will be like one of the things. I'm not sure. Would there be other connections? I mean, you might see like unit names redone or whatever. Like you said, unit and faction archetypes, but I think some of the names will probably be there, or maybe like they'll be riffed on or something. But I wouldn't put it past myself to make references in that sense, because usually I do it subconsciously anyway, in a sense that I'm thinking to myself, what's something that I executed on in the past that I think I could execute on better now, or I think would work really well in this context now, and it's like a different game, or it's like a different version of the game or whatever. That happens all the time. So building on my past experience, I think you're naturally going to see that. Beyond the natural stuff, like about deliberate things, right now all I can say is Ahmed, but there's probably going to be some deliberate parallels that I draw, or deliberate situations that I remake, or like, you could imagine like callbacks in a sense of like this mission that was a fan favorite in the CMBW campaign ends up, that archetype is also at play here, and it's different in really compelling ways because you're playing a different game with a different race and stuff, or different regency, sorry, different faction. Oh, don't hit me, I'm not racist. But, the idea is there's something different about it, and even still a player who's had that breadth of my work and behind them, they understand all of the stuff that I did in the past, or some of the stuff that I did in the past that I'm calling reference to. Yeah, that's a case where it's like, oh shit, I get that. I understand that. I recognize that. So I'm sure there will be stuff like that all over the place. Myrian's second question is, will there be any maps in Xibalba taking place in warped areas of the universe that hint at what the origin places of the more stellar regencies like Catethrons, Azos, and Sycora look like? I'm not sure about Kolopo Azos, because it feels to me like their madness kind of creeps in anyway. Like ideally, I would actually want terrain deformation and stuff around their bases, and like wherever they make units from and stuff, especially. The Catethrons, maybe. You might see, I want home regions, like I want home biomes in terms of, like the same way that I'm working on the flesh tile set and the organ tile set and stuff for Zerg in CMBW, so that you can have like orbital hives and whatnot. I want like graphics like that to represent, the home world and the home realms and stuff. This is what Sycora are able to do to make themselves feel more at home. And this is what the Catethrons, where they come from, or something like that. But because they do stem from other dimensions, it is a little bit harder to justify having like a full scale representation of their thing. It's just impossible to do within the same setting that you're in by default. So in that sense, yeah, you'll probably just see them bleed through a little bit, but not necessarily a full-blown representation, right? Because that's just not possible to represent fully within the setting, since they come from other dimensions in the first place. So they're able to express themselves in a completely different set of ways and manners than they can within the constraints of this more closed-in setting, right? So anyway, that reality is definitely going to be adjusted occasionally, but not necessarily in a way that like full blown you get like a proper understanding of it, because the conceit is that because you are a three-dimensional entity, you can't really understand what an extra-dimensional entity really looks like and what their world is really like either. But yeah, I definitely want to. The answer to this question is a wholehearted yes. I definitely want to have hints of that at the very least, that players can kind of make up their own minds as to what the rest of it might be. Fill in the blanks, so to speak. But definitely a lot of cases where I want to show that off. Thanks for your questions, and of course, all your support down the years. I think it's been years now for Myrian. At the very least, a year, so thanks. Knight of the Realm asks, what would be a good way to include replenishment of limited ammo, such as spider mines? Obviously, the cop-out answer here is just build more vultures. I'm trying to think about that. I mean, I've thought about in smaller scale RTS games, you could make ammo systems work a bit easier because you would be able to restock them with some sort of specialist unit. Like you could have a structure that restocks them, but then you could also have a case where you could remake the, like, maybe have like some sort of higher tier, tier 1 ammo unit user can restock it at the structure it came from. Tier 2 specialist unit can restock them on a mobile basis or whatever, like on a mobile basis. Like that could be really cool. But in a larger scale thing, it feels like it would be a really big APM sink and probably not worth it because of that. Maybe it would be an opportunity for higher tier players or something to do things, but I feel like they'd find different ways to find efficacy there. So I'm not 100% sure. In the context of CMBW or our future RTS games, which are all going to be around the same scale, if not much higher than CMBW, the idea is probably that you can't realistically do that, but I'll think a little bit more on this answer, and maybe we'll even implement something like this in CMBW, where like maybe you can, task your vulture back onto the fulcrum or something. I don't know. I've thought before about like maybe the vulture could build the thing similar to a scarab back in classic StarCraft, right? Where you have like the Reaver and stuff. And maybe it would immobilize the unit while that's happening so that it would be a little bit more fair. It would immobilize them and stop them from being able to attack. So basically like stun the unit for like 5 seconds or whatever it takes. So you can't just be rebuilding it during general play. That I think would be used and wouldn't be as much of an APM sink, and it would be more like there's resources involved in purchasing additional lobotomy mines, but also there's the downtime of the unit, but also I don't have to like do a bunch of actions to do this. I just have to make the tactical decision to do this. And again, your opponent can punish you if it takes like 10 seconds per mine or something, then your opponent can punish you by like finding your vultures where they're restocking and forcing you to either cancel, losing time, or, obviously kill the unit before or damage the unit or something before the mine is finished. So I'm not 100% sure if that helps to answer the question. The main thing that I would worry about is if it's an arbitrary amount, then suddenly you can just use like 6 vultures off in some side area and then like spam mines. Yeah, okay, it's going to cost you money, but is it really going to be that big of a deal? I honestly don't know. Maybe we can make it balanced. Maybe we can implement it. We'll have to see. But thanks for your question. It did proc some ideas. So honestly, cool stuff. And obviously, Knight of the Realm, by the way, is not a coffee supporter. He's actually like a legacy team member, you could say. He made the Butcher's Ballad campaign you can check out for CMBW, as well as a few other odds and ends down the years. He's contributed with concept art and stuff. Did make some melee maps like Nitro Valley, which I believe is still in the map pool. Let me just go ahead and confirm that, because it'd be really goofy if I was incorrect about that particular detail. And the other thing that I think is really cool about what Knight of the Realm has been able to do is he's used CMBW or my work in general, our work in general at the No Frauds Club as an excuse to get better at drawing and other things. So that's pretty neat. And yes, indeed, Nitro Valley is still in the map pool. Isn't that exciting? So check it out in the future this Saturday. 3Crow asks, what is your favorite AI personality for each race? And why do you like to see the AI play that build? Well, this is obviously a CMBW question. AI personality for each race. So I'm really partial to the hot drop type of build, where the AI builds star pads to go for, Wraith Trojan and then uses bio. Obviously, they don't use transports super well right now. But I really like the concept of that, where they're doing like, nothing that is specific about the build is super powerful up front, but you can really pick apart an enemy player. You can pick apart reinforcements. You can divide a certain area, and you can obviously use Wraith specifically to attack while you're like stationing some bio units out there. And the AI does sometimes do all of that stuff. It's a little bit of a luck of the draw type thing. Sometimes they look really dumb. Sometimes they look like gods. But I do really like that particular build. I think a lot of it is down to the micro and macro decision making that you can do there. So that's really neat. When it comes to the Protoss, do I have a favorite AI personality for Protoss? Back in the day, I would have definitely said like the Simulacrum build, the Simulant Swarm build, where they just spam sims. That's a little bit less efficacious now, but I would say I like the Lunatic Legion build, or like the general like Gateway plus Air Fleet builds. Solar Escort is another good one. I just like the idea of like, having legions of, ground units and then like a veritable fleet of air units, right? That feels somehow very Protossy, even though it's like higher in number. So I don't know. That's definitely something about that feels pretty cool. Then we can jump into the idea of the Zerg, and I really like the Gates of Hell build for Zerg. I don't know if it's really that good anymore. I don't know if it's good at all, but I fucking love the Gates of Hell build. To me, I look at the Gates of Hell build and I think, holy shit, imagine what would happen if this caught somebody off guard. Because the Gates of Hell, for those who don't know, is like you go up to 4 bases before you even build your first tech node. And it's just like, that's why I think it's probably not possible. It's a greed build. You won't see it in most 1v1s. But if you see it in a team game or something, this guy goes up to 4 bases and then drops a Quaseth pool and just starts flooding you with nonstop Nathrcore stuff. Like, it's absolutely absurd. That feels like a super cool build. When the AI executes on greed builds, it feels so cool. And it's something that I definitely really am stoked to see more people try when they're playing against the AI. And yeah, it's just cool to see. So those are my answers to that. And that's actually the last question that we have. So it's a nice and easy, just about an hour, just over an hour, in fact, for this particular episode of Prototype. And I do appreciate everybody's support. Thanks to Pr0totype for your AI-related question. I actually did an AI showcase when I was showing everybody from Gypsy Stream all about the project. And it did remind me of a lot of things that could be better with the AI. Maybe we can make some of those improvements, sooner rather than later. Who knows? But I'm really looking forward to when Veek has a bit more time to help update the AI in that sense, improve their general decision making and stuff to whatever degree he can, because that'll be really epic. And beyond that, yeah, just really looking forward to this tournament. Really looking forward to improving the audio visuals and the general communication of ideas to the players so that newer players can more instantaneously understand what's up with CMBW. This is coming with videos. This is coming up with, different ideas of presenting the actual in-game stuff, obviously having better sound effects for like more unique sound effects or whatever, and more unique visuals for overlays and such. And then also, on top of all of that, we definitely need, more portraits in the game, more unit responses, and tutorials, especially more campaign content. Come on. So we're definitely going to be doing all of that and more. I'm glad that you guys are all here for the wild ride, and I'm not just addressing the coffee patrons here, if you want to call them patrons, or coffee supporters, the Chad Coffee guys. If you want to join that, of course, you can head over to ko-fi.com/protogoandveek7. There's a link in the description. It's a little bit easier to do that than type all that shit. And you can send us some money. And we, of course, appreciate that. But we also just appreciate you guys spreading the word. And it feels like the word has been spread lately. Like, come on, dude, Herbmon knows about CMBW now. And, apparently Gypsy does. And, that's pretty cool. So, we just keep on keeping on, keep on trucking along. Maybe the next time we do an Ascension number 5, in a couple weeks, it'll actually have some foreign Brood War pros in it. I'm definitely going to be reaching out to some of them to let them know that that's happening. So, yeah, who knows, man? Who fucking knows? But it's exciting. And I look forward to seeing it happen. Peace.